Welcome to the midweek edition of Legal AF podcast. I'm Michael Popok.
I'm Karen Friedman Agnifilo.
And we welcome you to come and get this week's serving of legal and political analysis straight from legal practitioners Popok and KFA. We're going to dive down into two topics today. One, I hate to say it's on the front pages and it's on everybody's hearts and minds, but we're going to talk about the invasion and the human rights violations in the Ukraine by Russia and by Putin. But more particularly, since we are a legal show, we're going to talk about the International Criminal Court and war crimes, which have been committed already, which we have all observed, unfortunately, on Twitter, social media, on every video feed we can find. As soon as Putin started bombing and targeting civilian sites, including the Kiev TV station this afternoon, killing 5 people, and the second largest city in Ukraine, targeting that as well, killing over 20 people. He basically committed a war crime under the Rome Protocol that has established the International Criminal Court. We're going to talk about it. And then we're going to end the episode today with just KFA and I bouncing around about what it all means when the Supreme Court decides in a recent conference earlier in the week to call up a case involving a Colorado website designer who, for religious reasons, says that she should not be compelled to create wedding websites for LGBTQ community members, that it violates her First Amendment rights. And Supreme Court has framed it in a novel way, which may actually tip their hand as to how they're going to rule. And we'll talk more about that in the back end of tonight's podcast. First of all, KFA, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. I spent the day in court today in the Eastern District of New York watching my husband, Mark Agnifilo, on trial in a pretty big federal trial.
Yeah, see, that's something that other podcasts don't bring the street cred of Legal AF, Ben Masalis, my co-anchor on the weekends, me, you are day-to-day practicing attorneys, litigators, trial lawyers, and we give our opinions and some people like to call it speculation, but based on a seasoned approach from years and years and years of experience. And you live and breathe it every day, even when you're not on Legal AF, even when you're not in the office, because your husband is a well-known and successful criminal defense lawyer the way you are. And so that was great that you got to, I'm sure you didn't just watch. What were you able to do today?
So he likes me to come to the big moments in his trial to give him real feedback, and he knows I will give him real feedback.
That's right.
So today there was the cross-examination of the main cooperator. This is a case involving Goldman Sachs and an individual named Roger Ang and a 1MDB Malaysia fund, where the allegation is that they were bribing everyone from the prime minister to the king to just everybody under the sun. And some pretty big names are coming up during this trial. I've heard Donald Trump, Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump, Chris Christie, Leonardo DiCaprio. I mean, this cooperator is
You're quite the name dropper on today's podcast.
It's the cooperator. It's stunning. It's stunning. The people he's implicating as being involved in this massive bribe scheme of people who are either involved in it or representing him or palling around with him. He's a big name dropper. So it's very interesting.
Well, one name it doesn't sound like he dropped is Putin, Vladimir Putin. And that's somebody who we're now going to talk about in our discussion of what is the International Criminal Court? Where does it come from? What kind of jurisdiction does it have? And can it actually arrest and prosecute and put on trial Vladimir Putin for being the person most responsible for the war crimes that we are watching unfold, unfortunately, in the Ukraine, in Ukraine. I'm sorry, I keep calling it the Ukraine because I am Ukrainian American, and for the longest time it was the Ukraine, but since its independence, it's just Ukraine, as it fights for its survival and eventual membership, thank God, in the EU, which it looks like it's being fast-tracked to do. And where does this all start? And let me frame it, and then you and I, KFA, can dive in. The International Criminal Court's not to be confused with any segment of the United Nations. The United Nations has its own tribunals, not really going to criminal issues, but the International Criminal Court, while it cooperates and collaborates at times with the UN, is independent completely from the United Nations. It does not take a vote of the United Nations to make a referral to the ICC, which is how it's referred to, in order for it to be animated, in order for it to have life. If that were the case, then Russia would never be the subject of a prosecution, because it has, as most people know now, ultimate veto power on the Security Council to veto any resolution against it. You'd think, well, don't they have to be recused? How are they voting on themselves? And the answer is no. The way the UN is set up, they can actually veto a resolution, condemning them for bombing civilians in the Ukraine. But that's not the International Criminal Court that we're talking about, which was formed in the 1990s, and the foundation document that created it is something called the Rome Protocol. And now there's over 125 countries who have signed on to the Rome Protocol and have passed it by resolution or otherwise. That court sits in The Hague, in the Netherlands, and it is headed by there's a president and a vice president, but there's an office of the prosecutor. And the lead prosecutor, Karim Khan, has already announced that he is opening an investigation into whether war crimes have been committed and other atrocities have been committed by Putin. The other interesting aspect of the International Criminal Court is that it is funded by these 125 or so member nations. Ukraine is not a member state, but has signed on to the Rome Accord as recently as 1999 and 2000, and then again in 2013 and 2014. So it is, even though it's technically a non-member, it does have the rights to trigger investigations and prosecutions under the International Criminal Court. Russia, of course, is not a member of the ICC, which makes the arrest warrant and the execution of that arrest warrant and who's going to put a black bag over Putin's head and be able to get him over to the ICC. We'll talk about that in the back end of this segment, because they are not, and I'm just going to make this clear up front, they are not, by the Rome Protocol, the ICC is not going to try Putin in absentia, meaning he has to be present in order for this trial to take place. They have some protocols for not having the defendant present, but not in the case of a full-blown trial. So Putin's going to have to be caught and captured and brought before the tribunal, the ICC, in order for them to prosecute. And then the other interesting thing about it is, from a jurisdictional standpoint, like, what are the crimes? And right on the books of the Rome Protocol, the Rome Court, is targeting intentionally civilians, which is exactly what we're watching happen right now, as a frustrated Putin, thought he'd be taking Kiev in the first day or two, has been frustrated, and now has decided he's going to go to the most heinous set of atrocities and start just firing on civilians, including, I don't know if you saw this today, Karen, they bombed the Holocaust, on purpose. This is not an accident. There is a Holocaust memorial, a very famous one, Babin Yar, in Ukraine, which is a memorial to all of the Jewish Ukrainians, and there were millions of them, definitely hundreds of thousands, into the millions, that were exterminated during the genocide of the Holocaust. They literally went out of their way to bomb that. And the Freedom Square. So what's your takeaway from ICC and Putin and war atrocities, Karen?
So this whole Ukraine situation and this war against them is fascinating for many, many reasons. It's taken on the hearts and minds. They've certainly President Zelensky is won over the hearts and minds of the world in a way that I don't think Putin predicted. And I think it wasn't that way with Crimea. It hasn't been that way with other sort of other times in recent history when Putin has done what Putin does. But this one in particular, I think he miscalculated. And I think that's significant from the perspective of the ICC, because the ICC had an investigation open involving Putin that they pressed pause on, I think in 2014, due to lack of funding. And I think part of that is there just wasn't the will. But this one in particular, I mean, in the middle of it, during it, there was this announcement that, there's reasonable cause to believe that war crimes have been committed. We're opening up an investigation. And I think the fact that this really does have worldwide bipartisan support is a major factor here in why they're going forward. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, is commonly referred to, I think, sometimes as the War Crimes Tribunal, or sometimes people say The Hague. The ICC is the court, but it's referred to differently depending on who you talk to colloquially. And it's made up of prosecutors who go there for a period of time and conduct these trials. I know several prosecutors who were seconded to The Hague to prosecute war crimes over the years. And what does
that mean, Karen? Seconded.
So it means that in the case that I'm thinking of, in the individuals that I'm thinking of, there were prosecutors who worked for the Manhattan DA's office who applied for the job, and they were accepted for the job, and Cy Vance, the district attorney, permitted them to go and prosecute war crimes and for a period of time, for a period of several years as a public service, and before they would come back and be a prosecutor at the Manhattan DA's office.
Yeah, that's very interesting that happened, and they ended. And do you know which war crime tribunals they actually worked on?
It was the ones that I'm thinking of were regarding the Yugoslavia, the various trials involving Yugoslavia, and there were several.
Right.
There were several, and these are long trials. These aren't trials like sometimes, like my husband's trial is going to be probably 6 weeks, maybe 2 months, which is also considered a long trial. Some of these trials that go on at the ICC in The Hague, they go on for years. They could go on for many, 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 many years. And these are trials that don't have a jury. Instead, it's several judges. I believe it's 3 judges, and they present evidence, and it's a real trial.
Why do they go on? Let's say Putin. I could think of a couple of countries that have the ability and the desire to put a black bag over Putin's head. Let's say that happens, and somehow they are able to pick him up and bring him to the Netherlands, and put him on trial, and put him maybe in a box like the trials of Nuremberg, when the Nazi war criminals were picked up and tried by primarily American judges and former American judges, but other judges from around the world participated in that world as well. And they bring them on, and it's all about, well, maybe they string together a bunch of things, but it's certainly all about what's happening now in Ukraine. Why would it take a number of years to try that kind of case against them?
I think because it's so significant to bring a case. I think there's only been about 45 individuals who've ever been prosecuted by the ICC. And it's a significant thing to accuse someone of genocide, or accuse someone of war crimes, or to accuse someone of crimes against humanity.
Yeah. Targeting civilians here. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So those are that's a whole pattern of conduct. You have to prove, for example, that it wasn't an accident. I think they bombed a preschool today that was being used as a shelter, and people died. And I think, one of the things you have to prove is that it was not an accidental, that it was a targeting of civilians. That's part of it. And part of it is because you really do have to show that there is this long-term, these long-standing sort of acts of aggression, another term of art, a crime of aggression, that are being committed by these governments. So I mean, this is a major world leader, and you're going to want to put on evidence that this isn't just, he's going to have all kinds of defenses and his own justification about why.
I had no knowledge that the TV station in the middle of Kiev, during its regular broadcasting, right before an invasion of armed tanks, a whole group of 40 tanks were coming. I had no idea they were going to. That was a total accident. We were aiming for the park behind it. Yeah,
he's also think about it, the language that he's using. It's a peacekeeping mission, right? He has justification. He believes this is not an act of war, and that this is completely legitimate, and that he's permitted to do this. And you've got the Belarusians sort of underscoring that by kind of giving aid to Putin, right? That this is okay. And so, they have their own version of facts that you're going to have to disprove to prove that this was an act of war. In the beginning of this, about a week ago, I was noticing that that Putin's military, they were allowing reporters from CNN to videotape them. And I thought, with the tanks, I mean, they're literally videotaping them going in. And I was thinking, how could they possibly be allowing this? I mean,
allowing American journalists to be embedded with the Russian military.
Right, because it's so clear that that's proof of what they're doing. But in my mind, it just goes to show how delusional they are. And they don't realize they genuinely believe they are justified in doing this and that they're not doing anything wrong. I think they think they're going to intimidate the world and show how strong they are. And I think they really miscalculated that the entire world would turn against them in doing this and support Ukraine.
Putin's accomplished more in gaining national stature, EU admission, and potentially NATO admission for Ukraine than they ever could have done in the next He collapsed 5 years, accelerated 5 to 10 years. The Germans who were sitting on the fence with, well, we'd rather not. They're now let them into the EU. That sounds right. Yeah. Everything. So, he really galvanized in that way. And the one last thing before we leave the International Criminal Court, which we will follow as this prosecutor, Karim Khan, opens his investigation, and Karen and I will report back on developments that are publicly announced related to that, or if anybody from the Manhattan DA's office goes over to assist in the prosecution of Putin, you'll let us know about that too. The last thing I want to leave it on is, as Karen and I have alluded to or implied, people are prosecuted by the ICC, not nation states. So it's not going to be Russia that's on trial. It is the human being most responsible for the war crime or the atrocity or whatever the jurisdictional ground is. In this case, obviously, it's Vladimir Putin. That's going to be the defendant on the other side of the V.
Popok, how can the ICC have jurisdiction over Putin if he's not a member state?
Yeah, that's a good question. I looked into that. Apparently, it's similar to our analysis that we use in American court system for how a defendant can be dragged in to, whether it's criminal or state under a jurisdiction or a civil under a jurisdictional analysis, if they've done things I hate to say it, to target somebody or injure somebody in that state or that country, that's enough of a jurisdictional hook. So even though his country is not a member state of the ICC, he has done a war of aggression against a member state and therefore has given the prosecutor a proper jurisdictional hook to drag him in.
I think there are certain crimes that they have jurisdiction over him on and certain ones that they don't. So I think you were exactly right with the war crimes. If there were intentionally against civilian targets, crimes against humanity, like rapes and murders, et cetera, genocide. However, there is the crime of aggression, which is a new crime that was added to the ICC and the Rome Statute in 2018. And this is a new crime that apparently he cannot be prosecuted for unless the United Nations Security Council refers that to the ICC, which is why the veto you were talking about earlier is so important and so significant. So I think crime of aggression is probably the thing that he's so clearly has committed. It's easier to prove, but I think that's the issue here is in order to get jurisdiction over him and be able to prosecute him, they're going to have clear violations of war crimes, and the civilian targets I think are going to be the ones and the ones that are going to be key to the success in that prosecution.
That's a very good observation and then tying it back to the UN, and which sometimes unfortunately becomes sort of a feckless entity because it is so tied up in knots with the way their governing documents give to the superpowers, especially Russia, veto power while they sit on the Security Council, which is really the leading entity within the UN. It really controls everything that's important to anybody, especially when it comes to these kind of issues. So more to come. Unfortunately, I am sure there's going to be more counts of war crimes that we're going to watch unfold on our nightly news or throughout the day. And then KFA and I will report back on that and give our analysis and our good faith observations from our experience about what's happening. Let's move on to our last part of our midweek edition of Legal AF. We're going to talk about the Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS, and what on February 22nd it decided to do at one of its conferences where it decides which cases it's going to hear for the remainder of the term. And they have now decided, after much speculation, that they're going to hear the case that sounds innocuous on its face when I give you the title or the plaintiffs and the defendants, 303 Creative LLC versus Colorado, or the Colorado Secretary of State. Sounds pretty innocent until you get down to what are the fundamental constitutional issues that are in play, and why has this newly constituted 6-3 supermajority Supreme Court decided to take this case at this time. Now, this particular case arises out of a anti-discrimination law in the state of Colorado. Colorado rightly has on its books something that says you cannot discriminate. You can't be a bigot. You can't discriminate against people because of their ethnicity or their race or their, in this case, their gender or sexual orientation or their LGBTQ status. You cannot do that. You can't say you're going to do that. It's not a First Amendment issue. You can't advertise no gays allowed, just like you can't advertise no Jews allowed, which unfortunately was in this country in the 1930s and 40s, and even earlier than that in Miami Beach. There were signage in hotels that said that, and you can look that up. So you can't do that anymore. And the foundation for that is the First Amendment, which has two clauses. It has the freedom of speech clause, which we'll talk about at length today, and it has the free exercise of religion clause. And the owner of this web design company, who doesn't want to make wedding websites for gay people, basically, but she'll do other work for them. Apparently, she just doesn't want to sanction their marriage because she thinks that's only between heterosexuals, male and female heterosexuals, actually. And so she, but not really her, a church-based group that's collecting a lot of money and is publicly funding the lawsuit in order to change the law and have it look like what they think the Bible world should look like, which is, inconsistent with the Supreme Court. Fortunately for them, and unfortunately for the progressives that follow Legal AF and KFA and me, they have the numbers. And so there's a precedent from 1990 that talks about when governments, if they're being even-handed on how they regulate in this area, it's okay under the First Amendment, the Constitution. And there is a recent case, though, coming out of Colorado that just happened when they didn't quite have the numbers, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was still around in 2019, in which a baker didn't want to bake a cake for a gay wedding, also in Colorado, against that same statute. And there, that Supreme Court came close to addressing whether he had a First Amendment right to basically be a bigot, but stopped short because they had a technical procedural issue about whether the agency responsible for enforcing the law properly gave proper credit to his alleged religious view when they, fined him for not baking cakes. Came close, And so as soon as they had the numbers and when there was a new test case, what did the Supreme Court do? Let's now decide Colorado's statute again under these facts, under the web design. Now, the one thing before I turn it over to KFA, the good news is the newest justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson, will be seated by then. And even though she's not around, may not be around for the briefing, although I think she's going to be, that doesn't matter. She can still decide the case and participate in the oral arguments and hopefully work behind the scenes in conference to shape a proper result. KFA, what do you think of what's going on with SCOTUS? What are they doing here to monkey around with First Amendment and gay rights?
Well, when I first saw this case, I thought, oh, there's no way that they can't, that there's no way this has any merit whatsoever. They can't do this. But it's a very nuanced case. And I think the way they've nuanced it, I think we're in trouble, frankly. And I think the issue is that I saw that's sort of interesting is the question that is being posed is, can somebody refuse to service public customers in violation of the public accommodation law based on the idea that fulfilling this would be a creative act? So, and they're saying that the creative act of fulfilling it is free speech. So I thought this was going to be an exercise of religion First Amendment case, but it's really a free speech case, because it's like if
they rejected that, right? They did reject that, taking
correct.
The case on free exercise of religion prong, and they went to First Amendment free speech.
Right, because that one that's why I thought initially, oh, there's no way this case. I mean, and they were smart enough to reject it on that because that's a tougher case for them. But when you think about it, you can't. If she ran a McDonald's franchise, she couldn't put a sign on the wall that says we're not going to serve LGBTQ customers, because that's just anti-discrimination. That's just blatant,
or blacks or Hispanics
or anybody
Jews
else. Correct. It's just that's just blatant discrimination. Where they are making a distinction is that they don't provide a service that is just kind of the same for everybody. That the service they provide requires creativity. And their creativity is really their free speech, and it's their First Amendment right to free speech. And so what they're saying is that if I service somebody who's gay, you're forcing me to say something that I don't want to say. And so it's really a First Amendment. You can't force someone. Free speech involves both the ability to say what you want, but also to not be forced to say things. So I think that's where it's going to be tricky. And I think that if I had to guess, I would guess that it's not going to go well. And that's really disappointing.
Yeah, what we're teaching our legal AF law students is that the way that the agenda is set by the question that's presented, that the Supreme Court announces that they will be addressing on the case. They take all the briefs, they take all the issues, even issues that weren't even raised below at the Court of Appeal just below them, or at the trial level, because they can raise any issue as the ultimate highest authority of the land. And the way they frame that, it looks simple. It's one or two sentences, usually one sentence, but the way they write it is so pregnant with information about, I think, how they're going to rule and how they set it up, right? How they tilt the playing field by the way they write the question. So the question is, as written, while applying a public accommodation law to compel an artist to speak or to stay silent, does that violate the free speech clause of the First Amendment? I mean, the way that they set it up, it's like putting both thumbs on the scale about how they're going to rule. Because I'll do it this way. We're podcasters. Karen, you're a podcaster. That's great. We're on episode 8, but we're podcasters. Can we decide in expressing ourselves in the First Amendment, which is what we're doing every time we take this microphone? Can we say, oh, by the way, on Legal AF, we're never going to have any Polish people or any Black people on the show. I'm sorry. That's just, my First Amendment right not to interview those people or talk about those issues. Am I permitted to do that in a state that doesn't has anti-bigot or bigotry law on the books or anti-discrimination law on the books? Am I allowed to do that? Today, I'm not.
Yeah. I was going to say, you can't discriminate. I mean, but what's interesting about this question is, if, let's say, it goes the way we think it's going to go, it basically says that that any business that custom makes anything is going to be able to discriminate. And so let's just think of a basic t-shirt company that makes t-shirts. And let's say you order it online and there is no human creativity. Let's just say the creativity is the person who's making the t-shirt kind of, putting whatever they want on a t-shirt and ordering it from a computer, and it gets printed from a computer and then mailed from a computer. How are they going to define creativity and custom made? And what is it? Yeah. First Amendment free expression. What is expression versus? It's a
slippery slope, but you're identifying so well. And where does it end? I mean, I never really thought of a website design. I'm sorry for the website designers that follow Legal AF. I never really thought about it being as an overly creative process. It's not Michelangelo doing the Sistine Chapel, just as I don't think podcasting is an overly creative process. I like it. Some people seem to like our show, but I'm not sure that I would put myself in the category of an artist under what's going to be this new Supreme Court ruling. So it's going to be heard in October. It sounds like you agree with me. The way they framed the issue sounds like they've already concluded, they got the votes for this particular issue. It took them not one, not two, not three, but 4 conferences to decide to take this case up, meaning they didn't have the votes for the other 3. I think you have to have 4 votes to pull up a case, if I'm getting my math right, not to decide it, just to decide whether you're going to hear the case. You need to have 4 sitting justices, and it sounds like they didn't have 4 until this last go around. I can imagine who the 4 are. I could probably, all of us in Legal AF land could name the 4, I'm sure, that are in there. Alito, Thomas, and then either Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and or Amy Coney Barrett. I'm not sure Roberts did, because it's going to be sailing against recent precedent. I mean, how much precedent can one Supreme Court in one term try to overturn? I mean, what happened to the concept when you and I were in law school, when I thought, stare decisis, the legal doctrine that, precedent will be used for unlike other jurisprudence, other bodies of law around the world, legal systems around the world, that ours was based as a bedrock principle, that precedent would be used, and precedent would only be overturned in extraordinary circumstances. But that's gone now. No precedent is safe when the Supreme Court has a super majority of one right wing. I mean, listen, I'd like to see a super majority of the left wing of the progressive Democrats. I'm not sure I'm going to see that in my lifetime. I'm probably not, but certainly in the hands of them, it's like every harebrained idea that Clarence Thomas has ever had over the last 40 years, he's now able to execute because he's got the numbers. And I hate to say it, our Constitution is under assault. And the Constitution that I grew up with and I was taught and that I respect is under frontal assault by this Supreme Court. That's just my view. What do you think, Karen?
I very much do. And when you think about it, and I was talking about this with some people, and their initial reaction was, well, but what if their religion is that they don't believe in gay marriage? And I as soon as you transpose gay marriage for being Black, being Jewish, being a woman. And I think that's what hits home with people when they realize, enough looking for ways to continue to marginalize LGBTQ. Legal. It's a constitutional right. It's to be able to marry who you love, and it's time to change and not go backwards in terms of marginalizing people who are already marginalized by society, and it's just atrocious. Agreed.
And let's be clear about what we're not saying on this show or otherwise. We're not saying that a person doesn't have a First Amendment right to express themselves in a certain way that would be considered bigoted or off-putting or off-color or improper, short of certain things that you're not allowed to say out loud. We're not saying that. You want to tell your daughter not to marry the woman of her choice because you're a bigot. You can do it, and you're not violating any statute or law. You're allowed to, and we're not talking about thought police. We're not talking about what you think in your heart of hearts and your darkest moments about people or things. We're talking about expressing it in your workplace or otherwise in a way that's discriminatory, in violation of anti-discrimination laws that are on the books in these various cities and states, or that's guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. That's what we're talking about. And this artistic expression exception, which it looks like the Supreme Court is considering, because I hold a paintbrush, I can be a bigot. I mean, I really don't get why that steamrolls the U.S. Constitution because I have a palette and a beret. Sorry, this is my artist rendering of artists.
But in addition, think about it. She can not only will this give her license to advertise that they do not do gay weddings, which is what she wants. She could also advertise, I don't do interracial marriages. I won't take Black customers. I mean, she could, there's no end to this if you allow this.
Well, let me use an example that I started with from Miami Beach, because everybody knows I lived in Miami for 20 years and kind of got into the history down there. There in the 1930s, in sections of Miami Beach, hotels would advertise, literally hire a printer and put out an ad that they put in magazines and put on their walls in their hotel. And one hotel in particular had an ad campaign that was the following: always a view and never a Jew. You can look it up. I am not making this up. And then there's a museum in Miami that actually has all these things up. So so why isn't that, current Supreme Court, why can't a hotel advertise, hey, good news, we always have a view, we never have a Jew? And why doesn't that satisfy? Oh, because they're not an artist? Okay, so the artist says, great news, I do portraitures of your favorite portrait, unless you're a dirty Jew, and then I'm not going to do it. That's okay.
It will be after they're done with this case.
Right. Because they live in a hermetically sealed world. This is why I thought it was fascinating that and what a breath of fresh air in every way, shape, and form KBJ is going to be when she hits the bench, because she's the only person who's a federal public defender in the history of 230 years in the Supreme Court. Crazy statistic. She's the only person other than Sotomayor who was a trial judge. The rest of the judges came up through either appeals or, like Kagan, kind of skipped the whole judge process altogether. She was a part-time solicitor general for a while and is super bright, but she wasn't a trial judge either. So 10-year trial judge, federal public defender, federal sentencing guidelines. As I said on the show on this past Saturday, she has, and this is no hyperbole, she has a more accomplished body of work than any senator who is going to judge her for her position, bar none. And yet they're going to.
They are.
Yep. So that's where we are. We've finished another midweek episode. My favorite Wednesdays are with KFA of Legal AF. And so everybody, you're watching us tonight. You're going to download, hopefully, and listen to us on every place that you can download a podcast. And on Saturdays, we have the longer 1 hour, sometimes 2 hour version of Legal AF, where we wrap up the whole week's developments with my co-host and lawyer extraordinaire, Ben Masalis. And we want you to tune into that also. And now we've tried a new thing, which we got a taste for, and I think we're going to do a lot more often. We're going to do Twitter Spaces, which is sort of a real-time, instantaneous, let's all jump on into a digital room, and Karen and I will talk about an issue that might have just happened 20 minutes before. We just did it for the recent developments at the Manhattan DA's office, KFA's old stomping grounds, related to Alvin Bragg and the Trump prosecution. And we had 25,000 people that tuned in and listened to us on that. And so I got a hankering to do more of those. What about you, KFA?
Absolutely. I thought it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
We have to think of a way to end these podcasts, though, because I have to say, I'm so upset. Like, we talked about this case, this LGBTQ case, and I'm so upset and angry because I can't believe this is where our country's headed. I want to figure out a way to end on a high note. And I think that's why I love Mailbag, because that's a little more.
Yeah, listen, unfortunately, we don't blow smoke or sunshine. And sometimes, Ben said to me at the end of last Legal AF, where we went over all these issues, including starting off with a discussion of what was happening in Ukraine and Zelensky and leadership and how it and all those things. And at the end, I was, kind of dour throughout most of the episode. And when we broke and doing a little post-production, Ben said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah, but I'm really down." About what's going on in the Ukraine. I mean, that's part of my heritage, and my relationship is from that region. She's from Belarus, and so, it's really hitting home, and it's really a downer. But anyway, that's the people. We're not comedians. This is not a. They're not tuning in for that. They're tuning in for kind of serious but collegial dissertation and respectful dissertations about what's going on in the world. So I'm glad we were able to do it today. I'm Michael Popok.
I'm Karen Friedman Agnifilo.
And we'll see you next Wednesday.